Most of us think of neighbors as harmless people, living next door, someone you wave to, borrow sugar from, or complain about when their music gets too loud. But sometimes, the people living closest to you can be the scariest of all. The unsettling thing about neighbor horror stories is how personal they feel. It's one thing to run into a creepy stranger on the street, but it's another when the person making you uneasy knows where you live. These stories aren't about haunted houses or ghostly shadows. They're about real people, the ones who share your street or your apartment wall. And sometimes, those people turn everyday life into a nightmare. Tonight, I'll share 3 true neighbor horror stories that really happened. They aren't just strange, they're disturbing reminders that danger, dose, and always come from outside. Sometimes, it's waiting right next door. So let us dive into the first story of family who thought they'd moved into their dream home, until they realized their new neighbor wasn't who they seemed to be. The first story begins with a young family moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood. At first, everything felt perfect. The streets were calm, the houses were tidy, and the neighbors all seemed polite. One neighbor in particular stood out, an older man who lived alone directly next door. He introduced himself right away, bringing over cookies and offering help with moving boxes. The family thought he was just being kind. He always waved when they pulled into the driveway, sometimes even stopping by to chat. At first, it felt nice to have such a welcoming neighbor. But over time, things started to feel off. He always seemed to know when they were home, and he'd show up at their door at strange hours, claiming he just happened to see the lights on. The husband brushed it off as friendliness, but the wife noticed how often the man's eyes lingered on their young daughter. It wasn't obvious, but enough to make her uneasy. One evening, the family returned from dinner to find the man standing in their yard, staring at the house. When asked what he was doing, he smiled and said he was just keeping an eye on things. It might have sounded neighborly, but the way he said it made their skin crawl. The daughter whispered that she'd seen him looking through her bedroom window earlier that week. The parents wanted to believe she'd imagined it, but then they noticed footprints in the flower bed beneath her window, adult-sized, deep enough to show someone had stood there more than once. They decided to confront him. When asked directly, the man laughed it off, insisting he was just passing by. But his excuses never quite matched the evidence. Things escalated a week later. The family's security camera caught movement in the backyard. When they checked the footage, it was their neighbor, wandering around with a flashlight long after midnight. The next morning, when questioned, he claimed he'd seen a stray animal and wanted to scare it off. But the way he avoided eye contact made it hard to believe. The parents debated calling the police but hesitated, not wanting to start a feud with someone who lived right next door. Still, they installed better locks and motion lights around the property. One night, those lights saved them. The wife woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. She peeked outside and saw the neighbor standing at their door, reaching for the handle. When the floodlight clicked on, he froze, then casually pretended he was checking if the door was locked, but he had no reason to be there in the first place. That was the breaking point. The family called the police and showed them the footage. Officers gave the neighbor a warning and told him to stay away from the property. For a while, things calmed down. He kept his distance, stopped visiting, and the family hoped it was over. But late one night, the daughter screamed from her room. When her parents rushed in, she pointed at the window. Outside, barely visible, was the silhouette of a man ducking into the shadows. By the time police arrived, he was gone. But the footprints in the flower bed told the same story. They hadn't imagined it. This time, the police took it more seriously. They discovered that the neighbor had a history of trespassing complaints in other neighborhoods. He had simply moved here for a fresh start. The family was shaken. They realized the cookies, the friendliness, the small talk, it had all been a way to gain trust and mask his real intentions. Eventually, a restraining order was filed, and the man was forced to move out after repeated violations. The family finally felt safe again, but the damage was done. What makes this story chilling is how normal it all seemed at first. A friendly neighbor, the kind most of us would welcome. But sometimes, friendliness is just a mask. The wife later admitted she wished she'd trusted her instincts sooner. The subtle red flags had been there all along. But it was easier to brush them aside than believe something sinister was happening. And that's the danger with neighbors. They live close enough to notice everything about your life, even the things you don't want them to. It's one thing to feel unsafe in a strange place. It's another to feel unsafe in your own home. Because of the person living next door, the daughter still remembers that silhouette at her window. Even years later, she sleeps with the curtains closed and a lamp on by her bed. This story is a reminder that sometimes the scariest people aren't strangers in the night, the ones who wave at you every morning. That was the first story. Creepy enough, right? But the second story isn't just about being watched, it's about a neighbor who took things much further. Because sometimes, the line between nosy and dangerous isn't just crossed, it is shattered completely. And that's exactly what happened in story number 2. The second story comes from a young woman who rented a small apartment in the city. At first it was perfect, cheap rent, decent location, and quiet neighbors. Or at least, that's what she thought. Her next door neighbor was a man in his 30s who kept mostly to himself. He didn't talk much, rarely left his apartment, and always seemed to be awake at strange hours of the night. At first, she brushed it off. Cities are full of eccentric people. But soon she realized that every time she moved around her apartment, she could hear faint knocking from the other side of the wall like he was copying her movements. If she walked from the kitchen to the bedroom, a few seconds later there'd be a slow knock from the same direction next door, almost as if he was tracking her through the walls. One evening, she dropped something on the floor by accident. Seconds later, she heard laughter through the wall, not muffled TV noise, laughter deep and deliberate, as if someone was listening the whole time. It started to unsettle her. She told herself it was just thin walls, sound carrying from TV or music. But then she noticed her neighbor wasn't watching TV, he was waiting. At night, she often heard pacing from his side, footsteps back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes it stopped right by the wall behind her bed. One night she woke up to a sound she never forget, a whisper faint, muffled, but clear enough to recognize words. "I know you're awake." Terrified, she froze, too scared to even breathe. The whisper didn't come again, but the pacing started up. Long, slow footsteps, right by her bedroom wall. The next morning, she decided to confront him. She knocked on his door, but no one answered. She left for work, and when she came back, there was a note slipped under her door. It said, "Don't knock again. I hear you enough already." The handwriting was jagged, rushed, almost like it had been written in the dark. That was enough for her to call the landlord, but when she explained, the landlord sighed and said he'd had complaints about that tenant before. "He's odd, but harmless," was all he said. Harmless? She wasn't so sure. That night, the knocking was louder than ever. It didn't feel random anymore. It was deliberate, patterned, like someone trying to send a message through the walls. She tried to ignore it, headphones blasting music, but the moment she paused, the knocking continued, perfectly timed to her movements. One night she came home late and found her front door slightly open. Nothing was missing, but something had been moved. The chair by her window was turned to face the bed. She panicked, locked every bolt, and called the police. They searched her place, but found no signs of forced entry. They suggested maybe she'd left the door open herself. But she knew she hadn't, and she knew who had been inside. The walls weren't just thin, there had to be a way he'd slipped through. A week later, she discovered the truth. Maintenance workers were repairing pipes in the building, and one of them pointed out a crawl space behind her closet that connected to the neighboring unit. Her stomach dropped. It explained everything: the strange noises, the sense of being watched, the chair moved by her bed. He hadn't just been listening through the walls. He'd been inside. She moved out immediately, breaking her lease, no matter the cost. The landlord, pressured by her complaint and others, eventually evicted the man. But the thought still haunts her. How many nights had she slept, thinking she was alone, while someone stood just a few feet away in the shadows of her own apartment? To this day, she says she can't live in apartments anymore. She only rents houses now, with solid locks and no shared walls. Her friends tease her about being paranoid, but honestly, can you blame her? Once you've learned how easily privacy can be invaded, paranoia becomes survival. That was the second story. And as creepy as it was, the third one is on another level. Because this next neighbor wasn't just strange, and he wasn't just intrusive, he was dangerous in a way that changed an entire family's life. And unlike the first two stories, this one didn't end with someone moving out, it ended with something far more terrifying. This family thought their neighborhood was safe, their street quiet, their home protected. But their neighbor was watching all along. It's the kind of story that proves sometimes the scariest place to live, isn't, in the middle of nowhere at S, right in the middle of suburbia. So let's move on to the third story. And trust me, this one might make you rethink just how well you know the people living next door. The third story comes from a family who thought they had moved into the perfect neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, kids playing outside, and neighbors who waved every morning. It felt like a dream. Their next-door neighbor was a middle-aged man who seemed like the perfect suburban resident. He mowed his lawn twice a week, smiled at everyone, and even brought cookies during the holidays. At first, they considered themselves lucky. It's rare to get along so well with people living right next door. But soon, little things started to feel off. He always seemed to appear at the right time when they got home from work, when their kids played in the yard, even when packages were delivered, almost like he was always watching. The husband laughed it off as coincidence, but the wife admitted she felt uneasy. "It's like he knows our schedule better than we do," she whispered one night. Things escalated when the wife noticed their mail had been tampered with. Letters were torn open and taped shut again, as if someone had been reading them. They set up a small camera near the mailbox. Within days, the footage showed the neighbor casually walking over, opening the box, and flipping through their mail before putting it back. When confronted, he laughed and said he was just making sure no one stole it. But his smile felt rehearsed, too smooth, like he had practiced excuses. The family tried to shake it off, but then their kids began complaining about strange things. Their toys left in the yard would sometimes end up neatly lined on the porch, even though When the husband went outside to check, he spotted the neighbor crouching in the bushes, watching their house. Caught red-handed, the neighbor stood up and brushed it off with another excuse. "I was just looking for my cat," but no one had ever seen him own a cat. By now, the family knew something was very wrong. They installed more cameras, and that's when they captured the worst footage yet. One night around 3 a.m., the neighbor was filmed trying their back door. He rattled the handle for nearly a full minute before walking away when the security light clicked on. The police were finally called, and when they searched his home, they found something unsettling: detailed notes about the family's routines. What time they left, when they returned, even what the kids liked to play. There were also small items in his garage that had gone missing from their property: garden tools, toys, even a pair of shoes. Nothing valuable, but personal enough to feel like a violation. The police concluded he wasn't just being nosy, he was studying them, collecting details, and waiting for the right moment to escalate. The family was horrified. They moved out within a month, unable to ever feel safe in that house again. The idea that someone so close, so friendly, had been tracking their every move was too much to handle. Other neighbors were shocked. They'd always seen him as the model resident, the quiet man who waved at everyone. But behind closed doors, he had been something entirely different. What makes this story so chilling? Isn't just what he did, how well he hid it. For years he wore the mask of the perfect neighbor, while slowly crossing every boundary. It proves that sometimes the people we trust most easily are the ones we should be most careful around. The wife later admitted she had ignored her instincts for too long. "He was too nice, too perfect," she said. "I should have known something wasn't right." The husband agreed, saying the hardest part wasn't moving it, was explaining to their kids why they couldn't play outside anymore until they relocated. The scariest part of this story, the trespassing or the stolen mail the realization that someone so close had been planning something far worse. We'll never know what his end goal really was. Maybe theft, maybe something darker, but the notes he kept show he wasn't just curious, he was preparing. That was the third story. 3 different neighbors, 3 very different masks, but all with the same unsettling truth. Neighbors can smile at you, wave from their porch, even act like friends. But you never truly know what goes on behind their doors. Sometimes, the creepiest part of a story isn't the supernatural, it's the reminder that danger can live right next door. And once you've seen that side of a neighbor, it's impossible to ever feel comfortable again, because safety isn't just about locks and alarms, it's about the people who share your walls, your street, and sometimes, your life. And that wraps up these 3 true neighbor horror stories. Each one different, but all of them proving the same thing. Sometimes the scariest people aren't strangers at all, they're the ones living right next door. Whether it was the friendly man watching a little girl's window, the neighbor slipping through apartment crawl spaces, or the perfect suburban resident keeping notes, each story shows how danger hides in plain sight. These aren't ghost stories or urban legends. They real situations that remind us how fragile our sense of safety can be when it's invaded by someone we trust to stay on their side of the fence. So what do you think? Were these just coincidences taken the wrong way, or proof that sometimes people's intentions are far darker than we want to believe? Let me know in the comments side, love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more creepy true stories every week. Thanks for watching, and remember, it's not always haunted houses you should fear, sometimes it's the house right next door.